Classical conditioning is an important concept central to behavioral psychology. It can be defined as a learning process that occurs through association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. In other words, classical conditioning is a type of learning through which an organism learns to associate one stimulus with another. Now, it was first discovered somewhat unexpectedly by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist who went on to win the 1904 Nobel Prize for his work studying digestive processes. And it was while studying digestion in dogs that Pavlov noticed that his canine subjects would begin to salivate whenever an assistant entered the room. Now, salivation, he noted, is a reflexive response. It occurs automatically in response to a specific stimulus, such as food, and it is not under conscious control. So when the dogs began salivating in the absence of food, Pavlov realized that this response was not due to an automatic physiological process, but rather that it was a learnt response. So the classical conditioning procedure requires the existence of an unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response, and that is an unconditioned stimulus that reliably elicits an unconditioned or unlearnt response or reflex. So for example, salivation is the unconditioned response to the smell or sight of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, particularly if one's hungry. The classical conditioning procedure also requires a neutral stimulus, which will become a conditioned stimulus, and that is a stimulus which the subject can be made aware of, but which initially does not cause the unconditioned response. For example, the CS can be the sound of a bell, which after repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, will result in the same response as the food presented alone, therefore leading to a conditioned response, which is the salivating at the sound of a bell. Let's illustrate this. In a classical conditioning, there are essentially three stages. Stage 1 is an unconditioned phase, where we have the unconditioned stimulus, the food, which causes the unconditioned response, the salivation. We also have a neutral stimulus, a bell, which at this point in time has no effect. Stage 2 is an acquisition or training phase, where the US is paired with the neutral stimulus. Because the US is still present, this pairing leads to the UR, the salivation. After repeated pairing, an association is formed. Stage 3 is then a test phase, where the US is removed, and because there is an acquisition of association between the sound of the bell and the food, the previously neutral stimulus is now a conditioned stimulus, which leads to a conditioned response, and that is the dogs salivating. However, if the bell continued to be presented by itself too long, without food being presented after the bell, then salivation would eventually stop. This process is called extinction. Many responses can be learnt in this way. Another important aspect of classical conditioning is timing, and that is the precise timing of the pairing of the CS and the US, which can have a major effect on the outcome of conditioned response. Let's look at 4 of these. In simultaneous conditioning, the CS and US begin and end together. In trace conditioning, the CS begin and end before the US is presented. Short delayed conditioning, the CS begins just before the US, but both end together. And then long delay conditioning is much the same, but the CS is presented for a much longer time. Our research suggests that the most effective temporal arrangement occurs in short delay conditioning. So in its simplest form, classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs through repeated pairing of a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus that elicits a naturally occurring response, but eventually becomes a conditioned response. Our research also tells us the precise timing of the pairing of the CS and the US can have a major effect on the outcome of conditioned response. Now, the conditioning process remains important today for numerous applications, including behavioral modification and in the treatment of fears and phobias.